Hello, my name is Gabriela Gutierrez, and I will be talking about the Harlem Renaissance and how the mistreatment of African Americans caused African American people to create their own neighborhood and introduce a movement in Harlem. So, after the Civil War ended, many now free African Americans participated in American society, such as opening up businesses and taking spots in political offices. Yet by the 1870s, there were laws introduced called Jim Crow, and many African Americans were being exploited, such as those who had, sharecroppers. They would have to give their money away, and hate groups such as the KKK rose up and started lynching African Americans right in the street and taking pictures, and people would be around. They also intimidated African Americans from voting. They would threaten them if they tried to vote. And they had so many laws during the Jim Crow. And so, an article from the Smithsonian National Museum African American History and Culture titled A New African American Identity, the Harlem Renaissance, stated, quote, with booming economies across the North and Midwest offering industrial jobs for workers of every race, many African Americans realized their hope for a better standard of living and a more racially tolerant environment lay outside the South. By the turn of the 20th century, the Great Migration was underway as hundreds of thousands of African Americans relocated to cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York, end quote. So, with the Great Migration, people moved to Harlem in the hope of a better life, of better jobs, and being treated more fairly. Harlem started to gain more residents, and more, popularity. And so, stated by history in an article titled Harlem Renaissance, quote, by 1920, some 300,000 African Americans from the South had moved north, and Harlem was one of the most popular destinations for these families, end quote. So, history also briefly describes the Harlem Renaissance as, quote, the Harlem Renaissance was a development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century and the subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted, end quote. So Harlem was really, honestly, the place to be. A lot of African American families started moving there because they heard how popular it was getting. That wasn't the only reason, but they were leaving the South because of the Jim Crow laws, the wrongful racial profiling that they were doing. They were lynching men in the street. They were killing children. They were being put in prison for small demeanors just because they were black, and so a lot of these families took this opportunity to move to Harlem. And not just Harlem, but many other cities. Harlem was getting popular. Harlem, started becoming that place to go live at. And so once, African Americans started living in Harlem, a movement started to take over there. So the Harlem Renaissance brought about the new Negro movement and cultural achievement in art. So in a book by Stephen Watson called The Harlem Renaissance, Hub of African American Culture, 1920 through 1930, published in 1995, defines the Harlem Renaissance as, quote, in like fashion, the new Negro movement embraced more than literature. It included race building and image building, jazz poetics, progressive or socialist politics, racial integration, the musical and sexual freedom of Harlem nightlife, and the pursuit of hedonism. End quote. Sorry if I butchered that word. And so, this new movement started to arise, and it was all happening in Harlem. People started to become interested in it. More people were getting involved. They had like jazz club where both races would come and they would enjoy the night, and and a lot of these people were very young, probably 17 to like probably 30. a lot of these people were young and they were doing things that they love. You know, they were showing the world that they can also be involved in this. They can also be artistic. They can have music, you know. I mean, it brought about the jazz. I mean, jazz became alive in Harlem. And it was great. It was, you know, it was, I think, an amazing time. I mean, you had so many young African Americans being able to pursue what they wanted to, and they were good at it. You know, they were doing something that hasn't been done before. It, you know, wasn't being done. It wasn't, you know, this was something entirely new, and people were taking notice of that. And so the Harlem Renaissance brought about many talented writers, amongst other things. And one of these writers was Dorothy West. So in an interview by the Los Angeles Times titled Dorothy West, A Voice of Harlem Renaissance Talks of Past but Values the Now. So she talks about the Harlem Renaissance briefly, and a question was asked by her. The question was, do you realize something extraordinary was happening in Harlem? Her answer was, quote, oh, of course, we thought we were going to be the greatest writers in the world. We were all young and we fell in love with each other. We were all the same age and we had the same ambitions, writers or painters or so forth. We had all come from small towns. We were free. We were young enough that food didn't bother us, but when you're young, you can stand a lot, end quote. So this was Dorothy's description of how she saw the Harlem Renaissance, because she lived through that time period. She won a prize at 17. That's what took her to New York in the first place. And she just describes her time during the Harlem Renaissance. And I picked that quote specifically because I just love the way she describes the Harlem Renaissance. She really makes it seem, and I believe her, you know, she makes it seem like they were a big family. You know, they were looking out for each other. You know, Harlem wasn't just kind of defend on your own. It was, you know, people helped you out there. They were really a family. I mean, they were doing this movement together, you know, and they all, and the way she describes it, it sounds as though they were all in it together, you know, whatever that movement was, whatever the movement was happening, they were there together, you know, they were living in that time period, and they had each other's backs, really. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, fend for yourself kind of thing. It was more, if you need help, I'll help you, which was, you know, I think a great thing to do, especially during, you know, especially because they're African Americans, and it was really them against the world. I mean, because they were so wrongfully, you know, treated. And so that description that Dorothy gives, I think, is really beautiful to know that they loved each other. Yeah. And so, in My Modernette, an article titled How African American Art and Culture Blossomed During the Harlem Renaissance explains how, quote, fine artists flocked to Harlem during its rebirth. Most of these figures focused on painting, sculpting, and other means of artistically exploring the African American story. So like I said, it was, you know, it wasn't just writers, it was painters, it was sculptors, you know, and they all kind of came together. They were all, you know, artistically, they were all doing something artistic. And, you know, it was happening in Harlem. And there was not a museum, but sort of like a museum, like a building where, that was made during that time, where a lot of artists can go and showcase their painting. And it helped, you know, a lot of young African Americans go into that life where they can, you know, become artists. Unfortunately, though, I mean, a lot of these artists never got paid, and they never got paid a lot, and so a lot of them struggled to get by most of the time. I mean, and people looked at their art and they admired it and they said it was revolutionary, but in the end, no one really bought the paintings, which I think sucks. I mean, a lot of these artists deserved more recognition, and Dorothy also thinks that too, that a lot of these writers never got enough recognition that they deserved, and, you know, they never got paid enough. But, you know, but Dorothy was one of the ones who, survived, and she said that she was also lucky to do that. And like I said, the Harlem Renaissance is just a beautiful time period. Unfortunately, it was short lived and it ended during the stock market crash. But in an article, the same article by My Modern Net, they give hope about the Harlem Renaissance. Quote, though Harlem's golden age ended in the middle of the 1930s, its legacy remains strong today. In addition to the contribution made by its artists, writers, and musicians, the movement paved the way for future achievements, unquote. So, the Harlem Renaissance movement is gone. But like the quote said, it paved the way for more musicians, more writers, more artists, that are alive today, that are still, making art, making music. And though the movement is dead, I really think it lives within them. I think it lives within people. I mean, that passion that they had during the Harlem Renaissance, I don't think that passion could ever leave. It was such a fiery passion that they loved, these artists, they loved it. And I think, it was passed down. There's a lot of artists and writers and painters that just have this passion for it as well. And I think that's something the Harlem Renaissance brought and has never let go. I think it still remains with us today. And that's why I love talking about the Harlem Renaissance. I think it's just this passion that I get to read about how people love this, love this time period. And I love it myself. It's really great. And the Harlem Renaissance was really something. So that was my presentation. Thank you. Sorry it is longer than I thought. I really go on rants.